This graph tracks generative AI model costs from 2022 to 2024. The inference cost completely collapsed, plummeting 280-fold. Yet, over that same period, enterprise spending on generative AI surged from $11.5 to $37 billion. The cost of the underlying computational resource approaches zero, yet the total capital consumed by the ecosystem triples. If the foundational technologies required to code, design, and discover are getting exponentially cheaper, why are enterprise budgets and product development timelines expanding? In macroeconomics, when the marginal cost of executing an idea drops, the total volume of experimentation increases. We are systematically automating the physical and digital execution of work, but eliminating the cost of generating a product does not eliminate the friction in the system. It simply forces those costs to relocate downstream. This dynamic extends far beyond large language models. We have spent the last decade compressing the cost curves of digital infrastructure through open-source frameworks, cloud compute, and serverless APIs. The same compression is happening in biology. The cost to read and write genetic code has plummeted, making population-scale sequencing and custom DNA synthesis cheap commodities. In the physical world, we are combining these cheap digital models with autonomous robotic execution, creating self-driving laboratories that test chemical spaces constantly. By February 2026, OpenAI demonstrated that an autonomous, closed-loop experimental setup could reduce the specific cost of cell-free protein synthesis by 40%. Heavy industry shows the same trajectory. Reusable launch vehicles have collapsed the price per kilogram to low Earth orbit, while global battery energy storage prices sit at roughly 1/3 of their 2020 levels. Across disciplines, the historical bottleneck of sheer physical production is effectively solved. Execution is becoming too cheap to serve as a competitive moat. Market dominance now relies entirely on identifying exactly where the newly formed constraints are hiding. In systems engineering, we map this industry value chain as a sequential pipeline: ideation, execution, verification, and deployment. Historically, the execution phase was severely pinched, restricting output to a slow, expensive trickle. When a breakthrough like automated robotics widens that central node, the barrier vanishes. Production rushes forward in a massive wave. But the pipeline doesn't flow freely. The wave of cheap output violently slams into the next restrictive stage, causing the entire system to choke. The oversupply of cheap labor in one segment instantly creates a new scarce layer immediately downstream. Removing friction at the execution stage does not accelerate the final outcome infinitely. It generates an overwhelming surplus that exposes and ultimately empowers the final bottlenecks in the chain. We can track this exact relocation in digital infrastructure. Generative AI transforms specialist tasks like writing boilerplate code and executing software migrations into supervised generation. By April 2026, the DORA report confirmed that extensive Gen AI software users were reporting vastly higher productivity and workflow speed. Since the generation of individual lines of code is now cheap, the scarcity shifts. The engineering bottleneck is now system architecture, security auditing, and long-term maintainability. The same rule applies to data analysis. AI research assistants compress massive literature reviews and complex synthesis from days of grueling manual labor down to mere minutes. This flood of synthesized information creates a critical shortage of verification. The limiting factor is human judgment and the ability to audit the quality of the underlying sources. In media production and translation, platforms can generate infinite multilingual variants of a marketing campaign for pennies, pushing the friction onto quality control and brand risk management. As the marginal cost of digital generation approaches absolute zero, the only highly valued assets left are trust, proprietary data lakes, and complex workflow integration. This collision is even more stark in the biological sciences. The AlphaFold database now provides open access to over 200 million protein structure predictions. Pairing that database with automated lab systems drastically lowers the upfront cost of discovering novel targets and generating initial molecular candidates. But this diagram illustrates the problem. The digital discovery phase happens at exponential speeds, but it forces thousands of cheap molecular candidates into the rigid, linear physics of actual medical science. The pipeline chokes entirely at the wet lab validation phase. Every synthesized molecule still requires multi-phase clinical trials and rigorous FDA regulatory approval. Even if a therapy clears the regulatory hurdle, downstream insurance and hospital reimbursement pathways act as a final, massive gatekeeper. An artificial intelligence can design a breakthrough biological mechanism for a fraction of a cent, but the commercial reality of that innovation remains gated by the slow, expensive laws of human biology and regulatory safety. In clean energy, execution costs have completely collapsed. 2024 IRENA data showed 91% of new utility-scale renewable capacity was cheaper than fossil fuel alternatives. On average, solar photovoltaics became 41% cheaper. By 2025, the International Energy Agency tracked an 8% drop in average battery prices, with battery energy storage systems dropping to roughly a third of their 2020 levels. We have solved the manufacturing puzzle for clean generation and storage. Doing so immediately exposed a massive systemic deficit in our physical infrastructure. The energy market is choked by grid interconnection queues, sluggish permitting bureaucracies, a lack of transmission lines, and critical mineral mining constraints. Scaling cheap physical technologies is no longer a question of factory output. It is entirely constrained by legacy grid architectures and local zoning governance. Because profit margins reliably migrate to the owners of these new bottlenecks, businesses must completely reposition where they allocate capital. Startups have an immediate execution advantage. They can rent the tools that once required vast capital budgets, building fast iterations on top of open models and automated cloud labs. However, any company built solely around an execution capability risks a fatal commodity trap. A core software feature today is often an open-source API call 6 months later. This comparison matrix explains the shifting power dynamic. Legacy corporations possess a protective shield built on proprietary data, existing distribution channels, and deep regulatory knowledge. Incumbents will thrive if they weaponize cheap execution to redesign their slow physical workflows. Startups will only survive if they bypass the execution layer entirely and capture a totally new layer of scarcity. Measuring isolated task efficiency or tracking the cost per token is no longer useful. Those metrics track commodities, not strategic differentiators. To predict systemic value, monitor these true leading indicators: autonomous lab throughput rates, clinical trial success percentages for AI-designed molecules, and grid interconnection timelines. Watch whether legal, medical, and governmental institutions actually pass these massive operational efficiency gains down to end users, or if they simply absorb the savings as internal profit margin. In an economy where the cost of executing an idea is rapidly approaching zero, the future belongs entirely to those who control the friction that remains.